Hello and welcome to another of the eBiology Teacher Podcasts. I'm Mr. Doc, and today we're going to talk about bacteria and viruses. Bacteria and viruses. Of course, everybody initially goes, yeah, bacteria and viruses. All right. Not so much necessarily. Now, of course, we know bacteria and viruses have the ability to make us sick. We also know, there's your note right there, sorry. We also know that bacteria and viruses in some cases can be helpful. For example, if you've ever enjoyed the singular perfection of a good aged cheddar cheese, you have enjoyed the labor of bacteria, okay? If you've ever digested a meal, you've enjoyed the labor of bacteria, so let's not be picky. All right, so what we're going to do is take a look, first of our objectives. We're going to list some common characteristics of bacteria and viruses. We're going to compare and contrast bacteria and viruses, and then we're going to evaluate the effects of bacteria and viruses in terms of our ecology, our economics, and even our health, of course. And finally, we're going to talk about how modern medicine addresses both harmful bacteria and harmful viruses. So we've got quite a bit to do today, but this is going to be more of a survey of bacteria and viruses. We're not going to get into all the different cycles and the endospores and the immune system responses and all that other stuff, because quite honestly, we could spend days just on this topic alone. We're years for that matter if we got really deep and dirty into it. But we want to go survey over everything, kind of get an idea of how bacteria and viruses work. All right, and of course this is subsequent to our animal unit. We'll be doing a plant unit and a short fungi unit as well. So it kind of gives us a sort of an overview of everything. So let's go ahead and get started. First off, a little review. Prokaryotes are single-celled organisms that lack a membrane-bound nucleus and other organelles. And of course, prokaryotes are bacteria, and bacteria are prokaryotes. This does not mean that they don't have DNA. It just means that they don't have a membrane-defined area where the DNA lives, as opposed to, and live, obviously, I'm using as a colloquial term. That's probably not a good word to use. It doesn't live. It's where it stays. It's where it exists. Eukaryotes have a single-celled, and they can be multicellular, just depends, and they do have a membrane around their nucleus. So, of course, animals, plants, fungi, and protists, these are all eukaryotes, okay? We've gone over this in pretty good detail. The long and short of it is, prokaryotes are bacteria. If something's not a bacteria, then chances are it's a eukaryote, because that's everything else, all right? So that's sort of the easy peasy version of saying that. Everything else is eukaryotes except bacteria, and all bacteria are prokaryotes. All right? So, what are bacteria? Well, bacteria, first of all, can be classified by their shape. Bacilli bacteria are rod shape, as you see in the top picture right here. Cocci bacteria are spherical shaped bacteria, and the way that they bunch together gives us a different term that we use. For example, chains of cocci bacteria are called streptococci bacteria, and clusters of cocci bacteria are called staphylococci bacteria. Now, you have probably heard of strep throat. Strep throat is an infection of, you got it, streptococci bacteria. You may have also heard in the news of drug-resistant staph infections. What we're talking about there is a staphylococci infection that does not respond to drugs that are designed to kill it. All right? And we'll get into those drugs and what they do a little bit later on in our podcast. All right? The final type of bacteria is spirilla bacteria, and these are spiral-shaped bacteria. Now, some of these bacteria can possess flagella, or little tail-like structures that allow them to swim. And even the bacilli, you'll see those sometimes. And when you see a bacilli with a flagella, sometimes you go, is that a spirilla or a bacillus? Bacillus are rod-shaped, spirilla are spiral. They're pretty easy to tell if you see a good micrograph picture. The micrograph being a picture taken by a microscope. Here are some things that bacteria have in common, despite the fact that they have different shapes. First of all, most bacteria have a cell wall, not unlike plant cells. Now, there is a difference here. Some bacteria have a cell wall that will stain with a particular substance. We call it a gram stain. Okay? If a bacteria gram stains, it turns a particularly an interesting purpley color. And that tells us some things about that individual bacteria. We call it a gram-positive bacteria, meaning that it reacts positively to the gram stain. If the cell wall does not absorb the stain, we refer to that as a gram-negative bacteria. So that's one distinction between bacteria based on their cell wall. If they have a certain type of cell wall that will absorb that stain, they're gram-positive. If they don't, they're gram-negative. And gram-positive bacteria tend to have certain things in common. Gram-negative seem to have things in common as well. Just like every other type of cell, bacterial cells do have a cellular membrane. They also have cytoplasm. They do not, however, as we've already mentioned, have a membrane around that nucleus. They just have a nucleoid region where the DNA is stored. This does make a bit of a difference here, because if we think about how cells divide, cells that are eukaryotes, for example, undergo a process called mitosis. And one of the first things that have to happen in mitosis is that nuclear membrane has to dissolve. It has to break down, and those chromosomes have to condense, right? They have to get denser. Well, because bacteria don't have a nuclear membrane, that's one of the things that they don't have to deal with, okay? That also has implications in terms of how fast bacteria can reproduce. Because they don't have to go through that step, they don't take as long to divide and reproduce, which is why bacteria can reproduce very rapidly on a surface that has everything that they need. Like all living things, bacteria need a food source for energy. Some of them are autotrophic, meaning that they can either convert sun energy or light energy. Some of them are chemosynthetic or chemotrophic, which means that they use chemical processes to get their energy, and others are heterotrophs, meaning that they have to get their energy from the outside. And once again, as we've already alluded to, bacteria do have the ability to replicate, but they don't undergo mitosis because they don't have that nuclear membrane, and that can happen very fast. Okay? If we were to take cells of an animal or a plant and we place them on a petri dish with enough light and heat and moisture for them to grow, they would likely grow, but grow very slowly unless there was something going on we didn't know about. However, in 4 days, bacteria can go from this, which is nothing, to this. Ow! God! Now, I'll tell you where this came from in a minute. It's totally going to gross you out, all right? But let's move on a little bit more with bacteria. Common bacteria include proteobacteria, which have a symbiotic relationship with the environment. Proteobacteria have the ability to fixate nitrogen. Now, this is going to take us back a little bit to our ecology. Remember that our atmosphere has tons of nitrogen gas in it, and we really can't do anything with it unless it's fixated by either lightning, which causes a chemical reaction, or bacteria that have the ability to convert atmospheric nitrogen into things like nitrates and nitrites that plants can use, and then we get them from plants. So bacteria can be very helpful. Some proteobacteria include things like E. coli, botulinum, and anthrax. Whoa, wait! E. coli, botulinum, anthrax. I've heard these things before, and they're awful. They kill people. Yes, anthrax can be deadly. E. coli is a foodborne allergen or a pathogen that can cause food poisoning. But when we don't ingest them or we don't get them into our body, they are actually helpful. Okay, so in the right place, in the right context, those harmful bacteria are actually very, very helpful because they do something that we ourselves don't have the ability to do. Okay, so it's not like bacteria are evil. They're sort of like Jekyll and Hyde. In the wrong place at the wrong time, yes, some bacteria can be deadly. Anthrax can kill you. But in the right place and in the right context, they can be very, very beneficial, and they can do things for us that we can't even do for ourselves. Okay, so that's something to think about. Other bacteria include cyanobacteria, or photosynthetic bacteria, that are often found in aquatic environments. And what these guys do is produce, on average, about 90% of the oxygen that we breathe. So bacteria and sometimes they get confused or they get lumped into the whole blue-green algae category. These guys produce oxygen for us, and once again, they provide a great service. If they're ingested, could they cause us to get sick? Maybe. Maybe not. Not all bacteria are bad. I think you've been told that before. All right? Now, other types of bacteria include spirochetes like T. palladium, syphilis, chlamydia, and this is a good time to talk about diseases. And this might be a little pet peeve of mine. I'm not sure if anybody would stress this, but there's a difference between an STI and an STD, and I think now's a good time to talk about that. A sexually transmitted infection has to do with the actual pathogen, either the bacteria or the virus, that causes the disease. The disease is the actual symptoms that result from a particular type of infection, okay? So if someone has, let's say, chlamydia, okay, that's a bacterial infection, okay, that's STI, a sexually transmitted infection. That infection causes a disease by the same name, chlamydia. And the symptoms of the disease are swelling, irritation, pus discharge. I know I've gone too far, but you get the idea. A sexually transmitted infection is what causes the disease. The infection is the bacteria, and the disease is the symptoms that result from that. The reason why I stress that is most of them have the same name. The bacteria gives the disease its name because the disease is caused by that bacteria. There are some exceptions, so it is important to understand that the human immune virus is the infection. The disease that results from the viral infection is AIDS. Okay, so that's one of those common exceptions to that rule. So let's talk about viruses. A virus is a non-living particle of nucleic acid with a protein or lipoprotein coat. Wait a minute. We're studying biology. That's the study of living things. But Mr. Doc just said that viruses aren't living. And I've also seen on the can of Lysol that Lysol kills 99.9% of bacteria and viruses on contact. I don't know that they're lying, but that's kind of a mistruth, because let's take a look at what the characteristics of viruses are and see if they really are alive or not. All right, first of all, they don't have a membrane around them. They have a protein or lipoprotein coat, lipoprotein meaning made up of lipids and proteins. They're not alive because they don't have cytoplasm, which means that they're not an actual cell. They cannot grow and develop. They do not maintain a constant internal environment, which means no homeostasis, and they don't need energy, so they don't have metabolism. And if that's not good enough, viruses can replicate, but they can't do it on their own or with another virus of the same species, because they're not a species. They require a host cell of a completely different organism to do so. They can't have metabolism, they don't have homeostasis, they don't have cellular organization, and they can't replicate on their own. Those are 4 of the 7 characteristics of living things. They don't qualify, okay? So why are we studying them in biology? Because they impact living things, all right? They can act like living things. Yes, they can reproduce with a host cell, but that host cell is a different organism entirely. That's where viruses come into play. We've got to study them because they impact life, and they make us sick. They help us do things that we need to do. Viruses have a wide range of functions that have to do with life, and we need to understand them. All right? Viruses can be classified by, number 1, whether they have DNA and RNA. Basically, they're kind of like an instruction manual that they throw in extra instructions. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. They can be double or single-stranded, the DNA and RNA. They can be classified by their protein coat, and they can be classified by whether they have a membrane-like envelope. Okay? Type of viruses include polyhedral viruses, like you see here in the adenovirus. Helical viruses, like this rabies virus, which is kind of hard to see because it doesn't really give the helical virus its due. Enveloped viruses like the flu, influenza, and then we have bacteriophages, which attack bacteria specifically, and you can see these look like more of a Star Wars thing than they do an actual, living or non-living particle. Yes, non-living. Just keep it up. And by the way, I mentioned Lysol. How can you kill something that's not living? Think about it. What they mean is destroy, by the way. Just for the record. They mean that they can destroy. And we'll get to that in a minute. All right. So how do viruses go around? Well, let's take a look at a bacteriophage. What happens is this bacteriophage attaches itself to a bacteria, and it inserts its genetic material into the DNA's material. Okay? Now, I'm going to tell you a little story. And this is how I kind of see viruses. And somebody's going to get really mad at me. When I was a little boy, about 8 years old, I was playing in my grandma's pecan tree. And that was her prized pecan tree. You don't mess with grandma's pecan tree. And we knew we shouldn't have been climbing in there. Well, I broke off a limb. I fell to the ground. And my grandma was sitting on the porch, and she stood up, and gosh, she was mad. She, get over here. My aunt, who was, I think, 10 years older than me, she's probably 18, 19 at the time, she looked at me and she said, run! Right? So I took off. I've never seen my grandmother run that fast. She took me and she whooped my butt with that limb that I broke off her tree, and I never touched that tree again. What does that have to do with viruses? Well, my aunt was kind of like a virus, okay? She gave me a piece of information, and I followed it, not thinking whether I should follow that piece of information or that piece of advice or not. That's what viruses do. They insert this little piece of information or this little instruction, and the cell just follows the instruction like it doesn't know any better, right? And that instruction may be to make more viruses. It may be to make the individual sick. It may be to cause the cell to shut down and not work at all, right? So the virus is like my aunt. They throw in these little pieces of information that aren't supposed to be followed, but the cell does it anyway because, like me, it was dumb and just did what it was told to do, all right? I'm never going to let my aunt live that down, by the way. So the infected cell now does whatever this little piece of information told it to do. When the cell replicates, because it's been added to the cell's DNA, it makes more cells that have that same piece of instruction. And those cells start to make more and more and more viruses. Now this part here where the cell is sort of reproducing is called the lysogenic cycle. But toward the end, the cell starts to follow those instructions to the point where it's making more viruses and more viruses and more viruses and more viruses until suddenly the cell just explodes, right? Boom! It just, boom! Lysis, or the lytic cycle. Well, that's two problems. Number one, the cell explodes, which means the healthy cell is no longer there. Number two, when the cell explodes, all the little viruses that were in the cell are out into the body, and more viruses take over more cells, and it spreads and it spreads and it spreads. That's how viruses work. Now, the question is, what do you do about that? Well, we'll get there, all right? Just a couple more things I want to talk about viruses. Here's a list of some common viruses and their types. You can see here that we classify them not only by the genetic material that they carry, DNA or RNA, but we also talk about whether they're enveloped. The reason why that's important is because it has to do with how they interact with cells. If a cell thinks it's another cell because its outer membrane has the right kind of coating, it can fool a cell into going, no, I'm your friend. Not really, okay? We also talk about their shape, whether they're hedral or they're brick-shaped, oval, helical, spherical, all those other things. And here are some examples of those individual types. The papovirus, for example, is related to the human papillomavirus, that's genital warts, and it's been linked to cervical cancer. I'd like to take a minute to talk about that one in particular because it talks about how impactful viruses can be. Remember how we said that the virus can go in and actually change the DNA of the host cell? Well, in genetics, we would have called that a mutation. We also know that certain mutations can lead to cancer. So the papillomavirus, the human papillomavirus, has been linked to cervical cancer in women because the virus causes a mutation in the DNA of that area. And of course that mutation resulting in cancer, which is why you may have heard a lot in news and on TV commercials about the HPV vaccine. And we'll get to vaccine here in just a second. All right. There's another thing I want to include here, and that is you will notice that there are several sexually transmitted diseases on here, like herpes, You've got AIDS, hepatitis, and genital warts. There is one thing that these have in common, and there's another thing that the ones that were on the other list have in common. Those ones I just listed, the genital warts, herpes, hepatitis, these are ones for which we don't really have a cure. These are ones for which the individual will have this disease for their lifetime because we don't have a way of getting rid completely of the virus. Chlamydia, syphilis, gonorrhea, those are the ones that we talked about in the bacterial side. Those we can get rid of through antibiotics. So that takes us to our logical next step. How do we deal with bacteria? How do we deal with viruses? Is it the same? Is it different? We need to cover that now. Organisms can fight off viral infections if they learn how to fight off that virus. A vaccine is a small dose of a harmless version of a virus that's injected into an organism that causes that organism to have a stimulated immune response. Basically, this is like boot camp for our cells. We teach our cells how to fight that virus. What happens is our bodies learn how to fight that, and the next time our bodies are exposed to that virus, we know how to fight it off. Vaccines are available for smallpox, measles, chickenpox, polio, rubella, hepatitis A and B, and the mumps. Now, what is really going on in our cells? Remember, our cells can learn how to defend themselves if in the right situation. Now, if we have a virus and we're sick, let's say we get the flu, okay, that's influenza virus. Our bodies are not only trying to learn how to fight the virus, but the virus is still giving us symptoms. So it's really hard for our bodies to take care of themselves and learn to fight at the same time. It's like fighting a two-front war. It's just not very easy. But if I give myself a vaccine when I'm perfectly healthy, right, my body can learn how to fight that while I'm not dealing with those symptoms, okay? That's one of the reasons why people don't normally take vaccines when they're ill, because we don't want your body to concentrate so much on learning how to fight this virus that we forget about the virus that's already been infected. That's another reason also why vaccines are harmless, because we don't want to actually give you the disease. We just give you a little taste of it so your body, next time that your body comes in contact with you, goes, I know how to fight you. I've been there. I've done that, right? All right. Now, antibiotics and antiseptics are the things that we use most commonly to deal with bacteria and viruses. Now, antibiotics are chemical substances that are designed to destroy or inhibit particular bacterial growth. They are specific to bacteria. Antibiotics don't have any impact on viruses, and there's a very particular reason why. Antibiotics interrupt cell processes, metabolic functions, ability to reproduce. So those bacteria can't function like they're supposed to, and ultimately they die off. However, because viruses aren't alive, they don't have those cell processes. Therefore, antibiotics don't do anything. They don't have metabolism. So an antibiotic that affects metabolism doesn't do anything to a virus. They don't have the ability to have homeostasis. So anything that breaches the homeostatic condition of a bacteria, that's not do it for a virus. Okay, so that's important to note. Antibiotics range in different quote-unquote strengths. Really what we're talking about is what types of bacteria they have the biggest impact on. So we use kind of narrow spectrum bacteria just to kill that type of bacteria. We have broad spectrum antibiotics that kill bacteria in a larger spectrum, and we use those specifically for the type of infection that an organism has, okay? Antiseptics are chemical substances that are designed to destroy everything. They inhibit bacteria, they destroy viruses and stuff like that. Lysol, which I mentioned earlier, is an antiseptic. It's a disinfectant. It does not distinguish between healthy, good skin cells and bacteria and viruses. Its job is to break down those things and just destroy them, okay? It's not like it goes after just bacteria, okay? It's not like, antibiotics are kind of like a sniper. They look just for the bacteria, they boom, blow that bacteria up. Antiseptics are kind of like a bomb. They don't blow up everything. They don't care whether you're good, bad, ugly, whatever. Boom, it's gone, okay? That's what Lysol means when they say kills 99.9% of bacteria and viruses. They really mean destroy, because what we can do to a virus, we can't kill it because it's not alive, but what we can do is dismantle it, break it apart, take that DNA that's in there and just rip it to shreds, then it's harmless, can't really do anything to us. And that's really what we're trying to do with antiseptics. However, you might go, well, then why don't we have antiseptics for diseases like AIDS? Well, we could cure AIDS with an injection of bleach. Unfortunately, the patient wouldn't make it, so it's not really a cure, right? Antiseptics really aren't a medical option in terms of internal, because they're not going to differentiate between the healthy cells of your body and the cells of the bacteria and the individual viruses that we're trying to destroy. So they're really not that viable of an option. These agents can be extremely helpful, and they've certainly saved countless numbers of lives. However, bacteria and viruses have become resistant to these agents because these agents have been overused. What that really means is bacteria that are susceptible to a particular antibiotic, they're going to die off when they're exposed to that antibiotic. But because of variances in DNA, there might be a couple of bacteria that are resistant. Well, now they don't have any competition. So only the bacteria that survived are the ones that are going to reproduce. So the next time we have that infection, that same drug doesn't work again because that bacteria is resistant, and the next generation of bacteria resistant because they came from the bacteria that had the DNA that made them resistant. So what happens is, as we have overused antibiotics, bacteria have become more evolved and to go, well, if this antibiotic kills all these bacteria, these are the only two that are surviving. So these are the ones that reproduce, boom, 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 and then when we try to treat this, we can't treat it because the antibiotic doesn't affect on these, so we've got to get a different antibiotic that kills these, but then again, this one's left. So then this one multiplies, and now we have another drug-resistant strain of bacteria, and you may have heard that term, drug-resistant staph infection. That's a bacteria that has evolved commonly in hospitals because we use antibiotics and antiseptics so much in hospitals, and there's so many people and there's so much bacteria in the people that come to the hospital when they're sick. We've developed these drug-resistant strains of bacteria that quite simply are very difficult to kill because they've evolved. We're kind of forcing evolution's hand at that point. Same with antiseptics. Antiseptics, that's why that bottle of Lysol, which we keep talking about, 99.9% of bacteria and viruses will be destroyed. Well, at 0.9 is still alive, it's still reproducing, and if we can't find something to get rid of it, then that could cause some pretty big deal. Okay? I'm going to come back to one thing. If you ever watch those doctor shows, which I kind of like, sometimes they'll talk about the drug-resistant flesh-eating bacteria. That's one of those. That's one of those staph infections that's heterotrophic. It eats off human tissue, and it's drug-resistant. So if we put drugs like antibiotics in our system, it doesn't kill that bacteria. So it's doing the job. It's not as common as the TV shows would have you believe, and if you have it, it's really not cool and very tragic, but on TV it seems kind of cool. I'm weird, so I'm going to continue on and wrap this thing up. All right, some common characteristics of bacteria. First of all, we know they're prokaryotic. They don't have a nucleus. They can be autotrophic, heterotrophic. They can be chemiosynthetic, which means they get their energy from chemical processes, or they can be photosynthetic, which means they get their energy from light. We know that they're living. They have every characteristic of living things, and they're either rod-shaped, which are bacilli, they're sphere-shaped, which are cocci, or they're spiral-shaped, which is spirilla. Common virus shapes include Hydra, we've got envelope viruses, we've got bacteriophages, but we know that viruses are not living because they don't carry on all the 7 characteristics of living things. Both bacteria and viruses have the ability to cause illnesses and even death. However, many of them, many of them are completely harmless, and some of them are even helpful. Remember, you've got bacteria in your digestive tract that help you to digest food that you can't digest on your own. Thank you, bacteria. And anybody who's ever had cheese or blue cheese or any kind of really aged cheese, you've had bacteria, so that's helpful. That's nice of them to do that. And of course, bacteria give us antibiotics in some cases. We can get antibiotics from bacteria or mold that help us kill other bacteria. So they're not all bad guys, right? And also, we've used bacteriophages to direct mutations to get organisms with traits that we want. We use bacteriophages in genetic research, and they've been invaluable in finding answers to that. So they're not all bad. They can be bad, and we certainly should take precautions, but they're not all bad. all right, which means that we do have economic, ecological, and health benefits, including the production of oxygen that we breathe, the fixation of nitrogen that helps our plants grow and help us get the nitrogen that we need, and we can even use bacteria to make medicines. Finally, and by the way, we also use viruses to make vaccines that help us prepare ourselves to fight off viruses. So we use viruses to help us learn how to fight viruses. Talk about fighting fire with fire, right? All right, finally, how does modern medicine address harmful bacteria and viruses? Bacteria, we use antibiotics if the bacteria is susceptible to the antibiotic. Viruses respond in some cases to vaccines. Viruses are not impacted by antibiotics. If you have a viral infection, antibiotics are not going to help because antibiotics kill bacteria and viruses can't be killed because they're not alive. Okay? The last note I want to show you is really how dirty are things. We did a bacterial culture in class, and I had the students swab a fetal pig from next door. Okay, actually the colon, which is what most people would consider the dirtiest part of the pig, right? Here's what happened. Got by the way, this is a petri dish. It's got nutrient agar in the bottom. That's a food substance for bacteria, encourages it to grow. And look at that. One little thing. That's it. It's really clean because those pigs are stored in preservative to prevent bacterial growth. Then what I did was take a different swab, and I swabbed the papers that my students turn in. And I got this. That's 4 days of growth. Sorry, three days. It's nasty. I don't want to touch it. Great. So, who should be grossed out? The pig or you? Moral of the story is, to really prevent ourselves from getting sick from bacteria that can cause us to get sick, we should be careful. Wash our hands frequently, but don't overuse antibiotics because we can be wiping out all the bacteria that we can fight and leaving nothing else but the ones that are really going to hurt us. The other thing is, if the papers that my students are turning in look like this with all that bacteria on them, how come I'm not always sick? Not all bacteria cause us to be sick. Okay, not all bacteria are evil and hateful. So just keep that in mind. I think that's it. I think we've covered all the bacteria and virus things that we're going to cover, and it sounds like just in time. Have a great day, and I will see you on another podcast right here at MrDocSonLab.com and Vimeo.